In a gripping family saga, Alexandra Harrington uncovers a hidden trust that makes her the sole trustee of Oakridge Estate, her family's cherished Victorian home. Her parents, unaware of the trust, plan to transfer the estate to her brother James, igniting a tense showdown. Alexandra, secretly funding Oakridge's upkeep for years, faces a dilemma. Reveal the truth and risk family discord, or protect her birthright. As secrets unravel, she navigates betrayal, pride, and legacy with resolve. Will she reclaim her role as Oakridge's guardian, or will family ties fray? This tale of loyalty and revelation captivates with its emotional depth. Love this story's twists and turns? Subscribe to our YouTube channel for more captivating tales that spark curiosity and touch the heart. Your support fuels our storytelling, bringing fresh perspectives and emotional journeys. Like, comment, and share to join our community of story lovers. Stay curious for what's next. The silver tines of my dessert fork scrape porcelain as I set it down with care, though my hands tremble beneath the table. A slow-burning disbelief tightened in my chest, while the chandelier's crystal droplets overhead trembled with the hush that followed my father's proclamation. "We've decided to transfer ownership of Oakridge to James," Edward Harrington repeated as if it were merely another clause in a contract. "The paperwork is nearly complete." The words hung in the air like smoke. Across from me, James leaned back in his chair, the corner of his mouth lifting in that smirk I'd come to associate with boardroom victories and brotherly condescension. Beside him, Catherine smoothed a hand over her silk blouse, her smile tight and victorious. My mother, ever elegant, reached for my father's hand. "With James and Catherine planning to start a family," she said softly, "this feels like the right moment to ensure Oakridge remains in capable hands." I forced a breath into my lungs. The scent of roast lamb and rosemary, once comforting, now made my stomach twist. Capable hands? The estate I had nurtured from financial ruin, shielded in silence, saved from auction block whispers. They had no idea. And worse, they never asked. I I don't understand," I said at last, my voice low but deliberate. "Why now? And why wasn't I consulted?" My father's expression hardened, the polished surface of his composure cracking only slightly. "Alexandra, be reasonable. James is starting a family. He's building a legacy. He's worked at the firm beside me for nearly a decade. He will carry on the Harrington name and the legal tradition. This decision ensures continuity." "And me?" I asked, sharp edges now framing every word. "What do I get for carrying the Harrington name, for keeping this estate afloat while you all turned away?" James let out a breath of laughter, short and dismissive. "Come on, Alex. What would you do with a place like this? You live in that shoebox apartment downtown. You curate dead people's art. This house needs someone who can actually manage it." The irony clawed at me. For 10 years, I had quietly funneled my salary, grant bonuses, personal savings, into Oakridge's bleeding books. I'd paid the overdue taxes, restored the roof after a storm no one remembered, paid Mrs. Winter's wages when my parents claimed they were tight for the quarter. But now this travesty wrapped in polished mahogany and fine china was being handed to James like a prize for existing in proximity to their expectations. And they had no idea, not yet. I stared at the legal documents still spread across the table in the study. Earlier, I'd spotted them as I stepped into the room, their embossed headers and heavy parchment impossible to miss. The three of them, my father, James, and Catherine, had been practically giddy as they hovered above the signatures and seals. My mother's text that morning, "Darling, please join us this weekend. We have exciting news," had given no hint of what was coming. But they had missed something. My grandfather, Harrison Harrington, ever the meticulous architect of legacies, had created a trust, a hidden one. 20 years ago, it had quietly named me as sole trustee of Oakridge, its grounds, the house, and all attached lands. Walter Jenkins, the family's old attorney and Harrison's loyal confidant, had ensured the documents were secure and valid. And for 10 years, I had honored that trust in silence, believing that perhaps one day they might see me. Not just as the daughter who didn't practice law, not just the one who worked with art instead of assets, but as a Harrington who understood the weight of legacy in her bones. Now, as I sat at the long, gleaming table where generations had once gathered, where portraits of ancestors loomed with painted judgment, I realized I stood at the edge of a precipice. Reveal the truth, and I upend everything they believed to be theirs. Say nothing, and watch Oakridge be stolen from beneath me, like an heirloom carelessly passed to the wrong hands. I need some air, I muttered, rising from my seat before anyone could object. The heavy silence trailed me down the hall like a shadow. In the front room, beneath the gaze of my grandfather's portrait, I stood frozen. The old oak floors creaked beneath me as I glanced toward the study, where those papers waited, foolishly bearing James's name. But they didn't know what I knew. And soon, very soon, they would. Edward always did mistake quiet wisdom for irrelevance. I suspected as much, Walter murmured, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, the clink of ice sounding like a slow clock tick in the stillness of the club. His gaze, sharp beneath his unruly brows, met mine. Tell me everything. I exhaled slowly, willing the knot in my chest to loosen. They've drawn up transfer papers, standard according to James. It names my parents as sole owners and hands everything over to him and Catherine. No mention of the Harrington Trust. Walter's lips pressed into a thin line. So they're trying to give away what they do not own. They don't know, I said. They've never known. Grandfather never told them, and I never corrected the illusion. Walter took a long sip, nodding. He trusted you for a reason, Alexandra. He saw the rot setting in long before the rest of us did. The words landed like a confirmation I hadn't realized I needed. For 10 years, I'd lived beneath the weight of stewardship cloaked in secrecy, allocating funds with discretion, sacrificing personal indulgences, and safeguarding the soul of Oakridge, while my parents polished its surface for show. Now they were trying to hand it off like an antique vase, unaware of the intricate legal web that protected it. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. If I don't act, they'll move ahead. When the transaction fails, everything will unravel. They'll learn the truth anyway. Walter studied me for a moment, then set down his glass. And what do you want, Alexandra? Not legally, personally. I hesitated. No one had asked me that, not once. I was always the curator, the trustee, the quiet daughter. I wanted to scream, to shake them all, and ask how they could not see. But instead I said, I want them to understand, not just the trust, but the years I've given, the legacy I've carried alone. Walter nodded. Then we proceed carefully. You have leverage, but timing will determine whether it becomes a reckoning or a reconciliation. As I left Westfields, the summer sun burned too brightly, the honking taxis and bustling sidewalks, a jarring contrast to the velvet quiet of the club. My mind still buzzed with Walter's parting words. Timing. The next family gathering would be Catherine's birthday luncheon. If ever there was a moment to force a reckoning, cloaked in civility, it would be then. By the time I reached the museum, the afternoon light was slanting across my office windows, casting golden shadows on my desk. I stood a moment in silence, gazing at the framed daguerreotype of my grandfather, his stern eyes and unsmiling mouth so achingly familiar. He'd known this day would come, and now I would decide how it unfolded. I sat, opened my planner, and began outlining the documents I would need to present the trust's terms formally. There would be no explosive confrontation, no shouting match, just facts, deeds, ledgers, decades of proof. But in my heart, the tremor of something deeper stirred, a quiet ache for acknowledgement, for belonging, not just as a Harrington by name, but as the soul of Oakridge, its true guardian. And soon they would know. Walter leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, deliberate murmur. People prefer comfortable illusions over painful truths. The amber in his scotch caught the light as he took a thoughtful sip, his eyes steady on mine. Alexandra, your parents cannot legally transfer Oakridge to James. The estate is held in the Harrington Trust, with you as its sole trustee. You know this, but they don't. The words struck with the weight of inevitability. My grip tightened on the edge of the table. Of course I knew. I had known for years. But the trust was cloaked in deliberate secrecy, a stipulation of my grandfather's, meant to shield the estate from careless hands until the time was right. And now that time had arrived. I've been making the mortgage payments, Walter, I said quietly, bitterness clinging to the edge of my voice. I've handled the taxes, the renovations, the endless repairs for over a decade, and they've gone on living as if Oakridge were still theirs to dispense like some heirloom trinket. Walter nodded solemnly, his expression unreadable. Harrison knew what he was doing. He saw your connection to the estate, your resolve. He also saw your parents', let's say, unstructured approach to money. The waiter returned, setting down my Caesar salad with perfunctory elegance, and Walter's steak with an aromatic sizzle. We paused. Once he was gone, I toyed with my fork, the green leaves on my plate a blur of indifference. What are my options? Walter carved into his steak with a surgeon's precision, chewing before answering. Several, none ideal. You could reveal the trust now. That would stop the transfer cold. But the fallout would be considerable. You could wait. Let the attorneys discover the trust themselves during the title search. They'll be legally bound to disclose it, or, he looked at me, the air between us stilling, you could dissolve the trust, let the transfer proceed. The fork froze in my hand. Dissolve it? My voice was hollow with disbelief. After everything I've sacrificed to keep Oakridge standing? It is an option, Walter conceded, though he didn't disguise his disapproval. Not one I recommend. Harrison's instructions were explicit. He intended Oakridge to remain under your stewardship for future generations. My mind flickered through years of silent sacrifice, nights combing through estate ledgers, vacations forgone, holidays traded for tax deadlines. Nearly a third of my modest curator's income funneled into repairs and preservation. Meanwhile, James cruised around in his new Range Rover, and my mother swanned through charity galas draped in designer silk. They floated, oblivious, while I kept the house, our house, from sinking. They'll be humiliated when they find out, I whispered. Walter's voice softened. Perhaps, or perhaps they'll finally understand the magnitude of what you've done. He paused, though I suspect we both know which reaction is more likely. He reached for his briefcase, flipping the brass clasp with practiced ease. There's one more matter. From within, he withdrew a time-worn envelope, ivory paper tinged with age. The final stipulation of Harrison's trust. He placed it before me like something sacred. This was to be given to you either when the trust was revealed to your family, he said, or on your 40th birthday, whichever came first. I stared at the handwriting, elegant, looping, unmistakably grandfather's. For Alexandra, when the time comes. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. Inside, a single page of thick, linen-textured stationery bore a letter written in his hand. My dearest Alexandra, if you are reading this, it means the time has come. Either you've reached your 40th birthday, or the truth of the trust has come to light. Either way, I want you to understand what Oakridge truly is. It is not merely our family home. It is a symbol of our values, history, continuity, responsibility. I chose you to be its guardian, not only because of your devotion to our heritage, but because I saw in you a kind of strength that too many in our family lack. Your parents and James possess charm, ambition, and no shortage of confidence. But they live for the moment. They see inheritance as entitlement, not obligation. This is not entirely their fault. Privilege has a way of insulating people from the character-forging fire of hardship. That fire lives in you. The final clause in the trust, which Walter can explain in legal terms, grants you absolute authority. You may retain Oakridge under the trust, transfer it to whomever you deem worthy, or convert it into a public foundation dedicated to historical preservation. I trust your judgment implicitly, not because you're infallible, but because you care. Your compassion, your integrity, your unwavering sense of duty, these are the true legacy I hope to preserve. With love and faith beyond measure, Grandfather Harrison lifted my gaze. Walter's eyes were steady, the faintest glint of something like pride flickering there. He knew this day would come, I said, folding the letter with care, reverence threading each movement. Harrison never underestimated the nature of people, Walter replied. He was a realist, especially about family. I drew a breath, steadying myself. How long until the attorneys uncover the trust? 2 weeks at most, he replied. Your father doesn't linger on details, and this is a particularly complex transfer, but the title search will expose the trust soon enough. 2 weeks, that was all the time I had left to decide how to confront a truth that would irrevocably fracture or redefine our family. 2 weeks to weigh my legal right against the wreckage of our already fragile dynamic. I slipped the letter into my purse and looked at Walter. Thank you, I need time. Of course. He signaled for the check, then added gently, but remember, Alexandra, Harrison didn't do this just to protect Oakridge. He did it to protect something he saw in you. Don't lose sight of that. Outside, the midday sun lit the pavement in soft gold. As I stepped into its warmth, my phone buzzed. James, Mom wants to know if you're coming to dinner Sunday. Catherine has renovation ideas for the East Wing. The audacity nearly made me laugh. They were already planning renovations, planning to reshape a home they had no legal claim to. I didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, I veered east toward Central Park. I found a bench beside the lake and let the spring air settle over me, soft with budding promise, tinged with the scent of wet earth and blooming hope. 2 weeks, a future still unwritten. And finally, the truth in my hands. Rain traced cool lines down my neck as I stepped onto the stone porch of Oakridge, the ancestral house looming before me like a solemn sentry. Thunder murmured somewhere beyond the trees, distant but insistent, as if echoing the storm inside me. My navy blue dress, chosen to project poise and professionalism, clung damply to my skin, the hem stippled with rain. I hadn't brought an umbrella. Some part of me had wanted the weather to strip away the artifice. The door swung open before I could reach for my key. Catherine stood framed in the golden light of the foyer, her cream-colored outfit immaculate, her smile all surface. Alexandra, everyone's in the drawing room. Her eyes swept over me, disapproval barely concealed behind civility. Would you like a towel for your hair? I'm fine, thank you, I replied coolly, brushing past her. Inside, the scent of lemon polish and fresh lilies greeted me. Mrs. Winter's work. The housekeeper's loyalty had remained unquestioned, her salary quietly paid by me for the past 7 years. Not that anyone else in the family knew. Voices drifted in from the drawing room. My father's clipped authority, my mother's practiced laughter, and another voice, male, younger, polished. I paused in the hall, my hand brushing the worn leather of my purse where Grandfather Harrison's letter waited. Its presence burned against me like a brand, his final charge, the burden I had borne alone for a decade. Oakridge had not saved itself. I had, in secret, in silence. A shadow curator of our family's pride, protecting it from financial ruin while they prattled on about entitlement and legacy. I squared my shoulders and entered the room. The drawing room remained as majestic as ever, vaulted ceilings, gilded cornices, sunlight dulled behind rain-smeared windows, and the Morris wallpaper I had personally restored with nearly $30,000 of my own funds, hidden through the trust. Every inch of the room spoke of permanence. Every detail whispered my fingerprints, though no one noticed. 6 faces turned toward me. Victoria rose with a graceful rustle of silk. Alexandra, finally, you remember Richard and Diana Preston, Catherine's parents. And this is Graham Sutton from your father's firm. He's overseeing the Oakridge transfer. I shook hands, cordially, mechanically. Graham Sutton's grip was firm, his eyes too sharp, ambitious, confident, tailored within an inch of his life. A perfect Harrington pick. I murmured pleasantries and took the only unclaimed chair, a straight-backed seat positioned just outside the inner circle, a metaphor so blunt I nearly laughed. I got caught in the rain, I offered, brushing moisture from my sleeves as my mother handed me a glass of wine. We were discussing the timeline for the transfer, Edward said pointedly. Graham believes we can finalize everything by next Friday. Next Friday. My conversation with Walter Jenkins had implied 2 weeks at the least. But of course, my father had always believed in speed when it suited him. Faster meant fewer questions. That's sooner than expected, I said evenly. Graham smiled with corporate ease. We've expedited the title search and documentation. Unless something unexpected arises, the property will officially belong to James and Catherine by the end of next week. unless something unexpected arises. I nearly choked on my wine. The Harrison-Harrington Trust, still concealed in its airtight legal cocoon, was the very definition of an unforeseen complication, the key to everything. "And then we'll begin renovations," Catherine added brightly. "We want to modernize the East Wing, a home office for James, expanded closets, and a nursery eventually." Her hand slipped into James's, her tone unmistakably tender. "You're pregnant?" Victoria gasped. Catherine's smile turned demure. "Not yet, but we're planning. As soon as the transfer's complete, we'll start trying. We want our children to grow up at Oakridge, just like James did." Just like James did. The words rang in my ears, hollow with irony. My memories of Oakridge were not those of indulgent summers and unchecked freedom. Mine were filled with hushed conversations in the library with grandfather, who had taught me not just the names of ancestors, but the stories behind every oil painting, every artifact, every cracked urn. While James had roamed the grounds with impunity, I had been taught reverence, stewardship. And now they spoke of gutting the East Wing. A quiet fury surged beneath my composed exterior. They didn't see the rot beneath the plaster because I had scraped it away. They hadn't heard the bankers circling because I had paid them off. I had given Oakridge 10 years of my life, my savings, my silence, and they thought themselves entitled to its bones. But that time of secrecy, of sacrifice without recognition, was ending. Grandfather had always known it would. His mandate of silence had been less about secrecy and more about timing. The truth would either shatter this family or set it free, and I would be the one to decide. The crystal chime of glasses echoed across the room just as Richard Preston's booming voice filled the air. "Wonderful news," he declared, his grin stretching as wide as the mahogany dining table. "To the next generation of Harringtons at Oakridge." The toast surged forward like a wave, glasses clinking with cheer, laughter bubbling up in sparkling crescendos. I lifted mine, sipping only enough to wet my lips. My mind, however, raced ahead of them all, spiraling through implications and hidden truths. This wasn't supposed to be a celebration. It had been framed as a planning dinner, a formality, but here they were, behaving as if everything had already been signed, sealed, and celebrated. My mother's voice sliced through my thoughts. "Alexandra, darling, you've been so quiet. Don't you have anything to say about your brother's exciting news?" The eyes, James's smug, Catherine's calculating, Edward's placid, Victoria's expectant, all pivoted toward me. This was it, my cue, the ideal moment to drop the truth like a stone into their champagne, to shatter their illusion of inevitability with the revelation of the trust. I could almost feel the bitter thrill of their joy collapsing. Instead, I heard my voice, steady, distant, say, "Congratulations, James, Catherine. Children will certainly bring new life to Oakridge." My father's approving nod told me I had struck the chord he wanted, polite, composed, unthreatening. He had no idea the war I was waging beneath the surface. "Well then," so my mother announced, pushing back her chair with graceful finality, "shall we move to the dining room? Mrs. Winters has prepared something truly special for the occasion." As the group shuffled through the wide archway, Graham Sutton slipped into step beside me. "Your family mentioned you're involved in art preservation," he said in the polite tone of someone trying to fill a silence. "I'm a curator," I corrected, "at the Met, specializing in American historical artifacts." His brow lifted with genuine interest. "Impressive. That must give you a unique appreciation for a place like Oakridge, so much history soaked into these walls." "You have no idea," I replied, letting just enough irony slip to draw his attention. He gave me a sidelong glance. "Miss Harrington, Alexandra, if I may, you don't seem entirely enthusiastic about this transfer. Is there something that concerns you?" So he was sharper than expected. "I'm just surprised by how quickly this is moving," I said carefully. "Oakridge has been in our family for 5 generations. That's not something you transfer like a car title." "Rest assured," he said as we entered the dining room, "we're proceeding with appropriate diligence. The property history, title search, any liens or encumbrances, we're examining everything thoroughly." His mention of the title search made my pulse quicken. That was the thread, the one that, if pulled, would unravel everything. Once someone at his firm uncovered the Harrison Harrington Trust as the actual title holder. "And have you found anything unusual so far?" I asked, settling into my chair and forcing a nonchalance I didn't feel. "Nothing that would impede the transfer," he replied smoothly. "The title is remarkably clean for an estate of this age." He was either bluffing or hadn't looked closely enough yet. Either way, so the window was narrowing. Dinner unfolded in an agonizing ballet of silver and porcelain. Each course emerged with precision while the conversations circled around Oakridge's future like hawks over prey. Renovating the East Wing, modernizing the kitchen, expanding the master suite, even a pool house near the gardens. "We'll preserve the historical character, of course," James added grandly, as though he wore reverence like a tailored suit. "The exterior will remain untouched. It's just the interior that needs updating." I stared down at the delicate dish before me, untouched. I remembered the intricate restoration I had overseen 3 years ago, the painstaking revival of original moldings, the ceiling in the library. The paint matched to century-old photographs, all funded through the trust, all unknown to them. "Alexandra restored the library ceiling," my mother said, her voice a gentle surprise that lifted my gaze. "She found old photographs of the original design and had it recreated. Quite impressive, really." The acknowledgement stunned me. For a moment, I couldn't speak. "I didn't know you were interested in restoration," Catherine said with a smile that was more inspection than admiration. "There's a lot this family doesn't know about me," I said, the words slipping free before I could sheath them. Silence rippled briefly across the table. "Well, Ma," my father interjected briskly, "the library ceiling is beautiful, and we appreciate your contribution, Alexandra. I'm sure James and Catherine will maintain the historical elements you've restored." The conversation drifted onward, but Grandma's eyes lingered on me, sharp with reevaluation. By the time dessert and coffee arrived, the discussion had turned to signatures and legalities, the transfer of ownership reduced to mere ink on paper. I faded into the wallpaper of their conversation until Graham addressed me directly. "Alexandra, as a family member, you'll need to sign a quitclaim deed as well to ensure a clean title. I can have it sent to your office this week." I blinked. A quitclaim deed would force me to forfeit any legal claim to Oakridge, a claim I possessed, quietly, inarguably, through the trust. "I'll review it when it arrives," I said coolly, hiding the burn rising in my chest. The evening unraveled at last. The Prestons left with cheerful goodbyes. Graham's handshake lingered, his tone weighted with implication. "I look forward to finalizing this transfer with you. Family estates can be complicated." The pause before his final word made me wonder just how much he already knew. As I retrieved my coat, James appeared like a shadow at the door. "You've been awfully quiet tonight, Alex. Is something bothering you?" I considered it, laying everything bare, letting the truth crash down around him. The trust, the finances, the reality of who truly owned Oakridge. But then I saw it, the glint of triumph in his eyes, mistaking my silence for surrender. "Just tired," I lied smoothly. "It's been a long week at the museum." "Well," he said, self-satisfaction dripping from every syllable, "Catherine and I appreciate your support. You'll always have a place here, you know. This will still be your family home." The arrogance of it, the generosity in letting me remain in a house that was already mine, was almost laughable. "How generous of you," I murmured, fingers curling around the door handle. "I should go. It's getting late." Rain still clung to the air as I stepped outside, but the skies were clearing. Between drifting clouds, stars began to reappear, quiet, watchful, eternal. The storm had only just begun. Rain had lashed the city the night before, slapping windows and turning streets into dark, glistening mirrors. But by dawn, sunlight spilled through the clouds like a verdict, unapologetic and clear. It felt prophetic. As I stepped into my apartment, still damp from the walk, clarity had crystallized within me. The emotional haze that had blurred the edges of my resolve dissipated. Tomorrow, I would set in motion a revelation that would redefine Oakridge and my place within the Harrington family. Monday broke crisp and bright, the sort of morning that followed seismic personal decisions. I was awake before my alarm, The familiar pressure on my chest, resentment, fear, guilt, lifted and reshaped into a focused sense of purpose. I moved through my morning with intention, selecting a charcoal suit with sharp lines and quiet authority. As I buttoned the jacket, I rehearsed my opening statements like a litigator readying for trial. No confrontation, only truth, calmly and strategically delivered. By 7:30, I was at my desk at the Metropolitan Museum. I closed my office door, a silent signal to the world. Today required solitude and precision. I picked up the phone and dialed Walter Jenkins. He answered almost immediately. "I've made my decision," I told him, skipping any pleasantries. "It's time to reveal the trust, but I need to control the narrative." "I assumed you would," he replied without surprise. "What's your plan?" "No confrontation," I said with deliberate calm. "I want clear documentation, everything that proves the trust's legitimacy and my role as trustee. First, I'll speak to Graham Sutton, the transfer attorney. Then I'll speak to my family, but only once I've framed the information on my terms." Walter's silence held the weight of approval. "Harrison would be proud of how you're handling this." "Can you meet with Graham today?" "Yes," I said, "before the title search reveals the trust on its own. I want to make the disclosure myself." "You'll have the documents by noon," he promised. "My office will call when they're ready." The next call was to Graham Sutton. His assistant tried to push me to later in the week, but when I mentioned Oakridge and potential legal complications, I was transferred immediately. "Alexandra Harrington," Graham said, his voice shifting from conversational to alert. "I was just about to reach out about the quitclaim deed." "That's part of the reason I'm calling," I replied. "But there's more. I need to speak with you today." Urgently, a pause. "Is this something I should be concerned about?" "It will absolutely impact the transfer," I said, careful not to reveal too much too soon. "For everyone's benefit, yours included, I think we should speak before anything proceeds." To his credit, he heard the gravity in my voice. 3 o'clock. Will that work?" "Perfectly," I said. "I'll come to your office." I wanted the meeting to happen on his ground, a place governed by legal clarity rather than family history. With the calls made, I turned back to my work. The Revolutionary War exhibit demanded my full attention. Fragile manuscripts, intricate installations, donor logistics. It grounded me, reminded me I was more than a Harrington daughter navigating a trust. I was a curator, a professional, someone with an identity that extended beyond the walls of Oakridge. At 2 sharp, I collected the leather portfolio from Walter's office. He had organized the documents meticulously. Original trust papers, all amendments, detailed financial statements reflecting my contributions over the years, and a summary of the trust's legal reach. As I turned to leave, Walter offered a final word of guidance. "You're not doing this to punish anyone," he said gently. "You're protecting the estate. You're honoring your grandfather's legacy." I nodded, the weight of his words settling like a shield around me. "That's exactly what I intend." Graham Sutton's office was perched high above the city in the glass and steel tower that housed Blackwell and Associates, my father's firm. James worked there now as a junior partner. I had been to events in that building, shaken hands and sipped on champagne, but never for business of my own. As the elevator climbed to the 34th floor, I couldn't ignore the irony. I was about to derail my father's scheme from within his own professional fortress. The receptionist directed me to Graham's corner office. The view was panoramic, dizzying in its grandeur. Graham stood as I entered and, instead of gesturing to the visitor chairs, indicated the conference table, a subtle acknowledgement of the authority I carried. "Alexandra," he began, his tone respectful, "you said there were concerns about the Oakridge transfer. Help me understand." I placed the portfolio on the table with quiet precision. "What I'm about to share will redefine your understanding of the Oakridge estate. Before we open this, I want to be clear. This isn't a vendetta. My goal is to ensure that legally binding decisions are honored." Graham remained composed, but something in his eyes flickered. Uncertainty, perhaps. "Of course," he said. "As the handling attorney, I have a duty to proceed by the letter of the law." I opened the portfolio and slid the documents toward him. 15 years ago, my grandfather, Harrison Harrington, established a trust that holds legal title to Oakridge. I've been the sole trustee since I turned 21. My parents, I paused, meeting his gaze, do not own the estate, though they believe they do. Graham's professional mask faltered for a moment. He leaned forward, flipping through the pages with increasing concentration, glancing up at me, then back to the documents. This appears legitimate, he said eventually. Fully executed, appropriately filed. But why didn't the title search flag this? Because the title is under the Harrison-Harrington Trust, I explained, not under individual ownership. It would have surfaced soon, but I wanted to come to you directly. He nodded slowly, still scanning. These records, he tapped the financial statements, show regular payments from your personal accounts. Mortgage, taxes, maintenance. His eyes lifted sharply. Your parents don't know? No, I said quietly. My grandfather made it clear. The trust was to remain confidential unless circumstances demanded disclosure. That time has come. The heavy oak door loomed ahead as I stepped from the car, its brass handles gleaming in the twilight like sentinels awaiting a reckoning. I stood for a breathless moment on the threshold of Oakridge, the ancestral home that had shaped generations of Harringtons, and now finally demanded the truth. My heels clicked sharply against the flagstone as I crossed into the foyer, no longer an invisible guest, but the appointed guardian of this place. Graham Sutton was already waiting in the parlor, his lean frame composed, eyes scanning the carved moldings as if searching for some hidden inscription. He turned at the sound of my approach, offering a nod of quiet solidarity. In his hand, the manila folder holding the trust documents, an unassuming vessel for the authority that had unsettled the course of our family's legacy. The silence of the room crackled with potential energy. Moments later, my parents entered, followed closely by James and Catherine. My mother, Victoria Harrington, wore her usual expression of poised bemusement, while my father, Edward, exuded a practiced confidence that bordered on condescension. James, predictably, was expressionless, save for a flicker of curiosity. Catherine's eyes, however, lingered on me with veiled scrutiny. Graham cleared his throat. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Before we proceed, I want to clarify that tonight's meeting concerns legal matters affecting the Oakridge estate. Alexandra has requested my presence in my role as the transfer attorney, and what she's about to share carries significant weight. I inhaled slowly, grounding myself in the feel of the burgundy silk against my skin. My grandfather's color, his quiet strength wrapped around me like armor. I asked for this meeting, I began, voice steady, because it's become clear that there's a fundamental misunderstanding regarding the ownership of Oakridge. The truth is, this property does not belong to either of you, mother, father, nor can it be transferred without my express consent. My words fell like iron weights into the silence. Edward's face stiffened. That's absurd. I've directed Graham to execute the transfer. The estate belongs to our family. I met his gaze without flinching. It does, but not in the way you assume. Grandfather Harrison established a trust with specific provisions. As trustee, I hold legal authority over Oakridge, its use, its maintenance, and its future. You cannot transfer what you do not legally own. A beat of stunned quiet followed. Then James leaned forward, voice edged with disbelief. Since when? Since the trust was finalized nearly 11 years ago. Walter Jenkins, as Harrison's attorney, ensured it remained confidential unless disclosure became necessary, which it now has. Victoria's voice, low and cold, cut through the tension. You've known all this time and said nothing? I looked directly at her. Because I trusted that no one would act against the estate's best interests. That trust was misplaced. Graham interjected gently. The documentation is clear. Alexandra is acting within her legal rights. She has also been providing financial support to maintain Oakridge for the past decade. My father turned sharply to him. You're telling me I need her permission to finalize this transfer? Yes, Graham confirmed. Without the trustee's approval, the property cannot legally change hands. The color rose in Edward's face, but he said nothing. I pressed on. I'm not here to block change for the sake of it. I'm here to ensure that any decision regarding Oakridge honors grandfather's intentions and acknowledges the practical realities of maintaining this home. If James and Catherine wish to live here, I'm not opposed, but only if they respect its historical value and the financial responsibilities that come with it. James's brow furrowed. But Catherine spoke before he could. What exactly are you asking for? Recognition of my role, of the years I've invested in preserving this place, and of the truth. This estate isn't a prize to be claimed. It's a legacy to be protected. My mother rose, elegant but visibly rattled. This is going to cause a great deal of unpleasantness, Alexandra. I know, I replied quietly, but the alternative is deception, and I won't allow this family to continue operating under false assumptions. Graham stood with me as I retrieved the documents from my briefcase, laying them on the coffee table between us. The embossed seal of the Harrington Trust gleamed under the chandelier's light, silent but indisputable. Edward reached for the papers but hesitated. His voice, when it came, was measured. You've made your point. What happens now? I looked at each of them in turn. What happens now is up to all of us, but it begins with the truth. Graham nodded, closing his folder. We can revisit the transfer discussion once everyone has had time to review the trust. The air in the room had changed. Tense, yes, but clearer somehow, stripped of illusion. As I stepped back out into the night, the cool breeze kissed my skin like a benediction. For the first time in years, I was no longer defending my place in this family. I was defining it. Harrison Harrington had believed I could be more than an heir. Tonight, I had proven him right. Heated air hung thick in the parlor as I stepped deliberately into the space that had always been mine by birthright, yet never by recognition. This evening, that would change. Graham Sutton's sedan pulled up the drive just as I closed my door. He emerged, calm and composed, his tailored gray suit absorbing the fading light with an almost ceremonial gravity. His leather portfolio was clutched like a declaration of war, neat, controlled, inevitable. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his voice low and braced with gravity. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, surprised by the cool steadiness that steadied my tone, even as my pulse surged beneath my skin. My mother opened the door before we could reach the bell. Her eyes widened at the sight of us together. Her polished smile faltered by a breath. "Alexandra, Mr. Sutton, we weren't expecting you both." There was an undercurrent of tension. She had hoped, perhaps, for more control. "There are preliminary matters that require attention," I said, breezing past her into the marble-tiled foyer with a grace I'd inherited but rarely wielded. In the library, my father stood rooted near the hearth like a self-appointed monarch. James lounged in Grandfather Harrison's leather chair, an heir presumptive enthroned prematurely. The symbolism was almost too perfect. "Alexandra." My father's nod was curt, a formality laced with irritation. Then, noticing Graham, his brow creased. "Graham, I didn't expect you to bring Alexandra into this discussion." "Actually, Edward," Graham replied, his voice a polished instrument of discretion, "Alexandra requested this meeting. There are matters concerning Oakridge that require the family's immediate attention." Confusion crossed my father's face like a shadow slipping over glass. "But the transfer paperwork is proceeding, isn't it?" he asked, voice tight. "That's what we need to discuss," I interjected, stepping into the center of the room, owning it. "Perhaps we should all sit down." My mother sank delicately onto the sofa's arm, her eyes flitting between my father and me, reading signals, seeking clarity. One absence, however, was impossible to ignore. "Where is Catherine?" I asked, needing the extra second to calm my breath. "She's meeting with the interior designer," James answered, not looking up from his phone. "I'll brief her later, if there's anything worth relaying." A cruel twist. Catherine, redesigning a home she would never legally possess. The irony might have been amusing in another life. Graham turned toward me, nodding. The room quieted, the moment offered to me like a stage. "I asked for this meeting," I began, voice level, deliberate. "There is something you all need to understand about Oakridge, something that directly affects the transfer you are trying to execute." My father's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about, Alexandra?" I placed the aged documents on the polished coffee table. The crackle of parchment was sharp in the silence. 15 years ago, Grandfather Harrison created a trust, legally transferring ownership of Oakridge into that entity. I have been the sole trustee since I turned 21. The silence was immediate and absolute. My father stared at the papers, as if disbelief alone might will them into non-existence. My mother clutched at the pearls around her throat, the gesture reflexive, rehearsed. James leaned forward, his brow knitted in confusion that swiftly congealed into something more volatile. "That's impossible," my father said, dangerously soft. "He would never do something like that without telling me." "He did tell someone," I said evenly. "Walter Jenkins facilitated the trust. Grandfather insisted it remain confidential until circumstances required disclosure." Graham cleared his throat with judicial restraint. "I've reviewed the documentation. The Harrison Harrington Trust is the legal owner of Oakridge. The transfer from your parents' names was executed 15 years ago, with Alexandra named as trustee upon reaching legal age." My father's face flushed crimson. "This is absurd, a mistake, some bureaucratic error." "There's no mistake," I replied, sliding forward a thick bundle of records. "For the last 10 years, I've been covering Oakridge's mortgage, taxes, repairs, and preservation, all funded through the trust. That's why you were unaware." My mother gasped. "You've been paying the mortgage? But how? Why?" "Because grandfather knew the estate was vulnerable," I explained, my voice firm. "He saw that you and Dad were struggling even then, and he understood that the strain would only increase." James snatched the financials, scanning the numbers. His face paled as he calculated what I already knew. This is hundreds of thousands of dollars," he said. "Where did you get that kind of money?" "I lived simply. I invested wisely. I prioritized Oakridge over indulgence," and I said. "Anything I couldn't cover from my salary, I supplemented with the trust's portfolio." Grandfather ensured it was robust. My father rifled through the trust deed now, his legal acumen awakening, comprehending the implications faster than he wanted to. His eyes lifted, sharp and glinting. "So you've been running this place behind our backs, letting us believe it was still ours, playing us for fools." "No," I said quietly. "I've been safeguarding the family legacy while honoring grandfather's explicit wishes. The trust required privacy until someone tried to take what they didn't legally own." My mother's voice broke through, hushed. "So, us giving the estate to James triggered this?" "Exactly," Graham confirmed. "Attempting to transfer property you no longer legally possess necessitated disclosure." James slammed the documents down. "This is insanity. There must be a legal workaround. We can challenge this. She can't just claim Oakridge now after all our planning." "It's not about claiming anything," I said, sharp but measured. "It's about honoring the truth that has been in place for 15 years. Oakridge belongs to the trust, and I am its steward." My father rounded on Graham, rage cracking through his composure. "You're my lawyer, fix this." But Graham stood firm. "Edward, I represent the firm handling the transfer, yes, but I also have a duty to uphold legal truth. The trust is valid. The documentation is unimpeachable." My father's mouth thinned. The fire behind him flickered, casting uneven light across a legacy unraveling. James's bitter laugh cut through the air like a snapped violin string. "Conditions?" he sneered, incredulous. "You're going to dictate terms to us? About our family home?" I held his glare, unwavering. "Our family home," I corrected firmly. "Not yours alone. Oakridge belongs to the Harrington legacy, a legacy I've quietly safeguarded for over a decade while you've climbed the corporate ladder and drawn up grand renovation plans for a property you never legally owned." My mother, seated beside him, turned wide-eyed toward me and then to Graham Sutton. "So what does this mean?" she asked, voice tremulous. "James and Catherine can't live at Oakridge after all?" I had expected this, the pivotal question that would let me shift from shock to solution. I chose my words with care. "That depends. The trust grants me full authority over Oakridge's future, but I'm not opposed to James and his family residing there, under certain conditions." "What conditions?" my father, Edward Harrington, asked, his legal mind already parsing implications, calculating potential concessions. His voice was cool, neutral, dangerously so. I inhaled deeply, steadying myself. This was no longer about legalities. It was about principles, about drawing lines that had long been blurred. "First," I began, "acknowledgement of the trust, of my role as trustee. No more challenges, no attempts to circumvent or reinterpret grandfather's intentions." James shifted in his seat, barely containing his anger. My mother looked as though she were clinging to some unseen support. My father remained inscrutable, a marble statue of calculation. Second, I continued, a family council. All major decisions regarding Oakridge's upkeep and preservation will go through it. I will retain final authority, outlined in the trust. This estate cannot survive whims or unchecked egos. Silence met my words. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall punctuated the tension. Third, financial transparency. If James and Catherine want to live at Oakridge, they'll need to contribute significantly to its maintenance. No more luxury cars, exotic getaways, or expense-free living at my expense. James rose halfway from his chair, face flushed. How dare you? James, my father said sharply, raising a hand to silence him. Let her finish. I met his gaze, cold, focused. Lastly, the estate's historical character must be preserved. No gutting walls or installing rooftop terraces. All modifications must receive approval from the council, and preserving Oakridge's architectural and historical integrity will be our highest priority. Edward regarded me with a narrowed analytical expression. And if we agree to all this, then James and Catherine may reside here. The trust permits family occupancy, provided Oakridge's protected status remains intact. I paused, allowing the weight of my words to land. I don't want to keep anyone out. I want this place to be treated with the care it deserves. And if we don't, James challenged, arms crossed like a petulant schoolboy denied a toy. I didn't flinch. Then I'll invoke the alternative clause in the trust, grandfather's contingency for noncompliance. Oakridge will become a historical foundation with limited family access. It was his final safeguard should cooperation prove impossible. The room chilled in the silence that followed, not from threat, but from the irrevocable truth now laid bare. I wasn't lashing out. I was protecting what mattered. Graham Sutton stepped in, voice calm but firm. Perhaps it's wise to take time to process everything before any decisions are made. The transfer cannot proceed as previously intended, but there is room here for a family arrangement, one that honors the legal framework and the emotional ties that bind you all to Oakridge. My father rose abruptly. I need to speak with Walter Jenkins. If this trust is genuine, he's got a great deal to answer for. Keeping this hidden for years. He was following grandfather's explicit instructions, I interjected. His professional obligation was to his client, not to you. Edward's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue further. James, let's go. Graham, he added over his shoulder, I expect a full legal briefing in the morning. I'll prepare it, Edward, Graham replied evenly, but I must advise, the trust appears airtight. Your best path forward may be cooperation, not confrontation. As they moved toward the door, my mother lingered behind. She approached me slowly, her expression a tangle of emotion, confusion, guilt, perhaps even grief. All these years, she said softly, you were bearing this alone. Why didn't you tell us you were funding Oakridge's upkeep? Her voice was gentle, but the question landed like a stone in my chest. Would you have believed me? I asked. Would you have understood what it meant? Or would it have been written off as me being dramatic again? She flinched, visibly, as if struck by the echo of old dismissals. We've underestimated you, she murmured. I've underestimated you. It was barely more than a whisper, but it was more than I had expected. A sliver of recognition. A door opening. As my parents and brother disappeared down the corridor, their voices receding, Graham began gathering his papers. You handled that remarkably well, he said, genuine admiration in his tone. Most would have used this moment for revenge. Revenge was never my aim, I said, suddenly aware of the fatigue descending upon me like a heavy shawl. I just wanted the truth acknowledged, for myself and for Oakridge. Graham nodded slowly. Well, I think you've achieved that tonight. The future won't be simple, but there's a possibility now for something far better than the past. Later, as I drove away from Oakridge under a dusky lavender sky, the silhouette of the estate shrinking behind me, I felt something unexpected. Relief. The secret I had carried for so long was finally exposed. And though the fallout had been fraught with tension, beneath it all was the glimmer of something new. the first fragile thread of honesty weaving through a long, tangled family. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like Oakridge's silent protector. I felt like its rightful steward, recognized, respected, and no longer invisible. The next morning arrived wrapped in a silence so complete it was unnerving. I had braced for a storm, accusatory calls, legal threats, demands for explanations, but my phone remained still as I dressed and made my way to the museum. No fury, no frenzy, just quiet. It was the quiet of strategy, of chess pieces moving in shadow. My family had never been known for restraint, which made their silence all the more telling. They were planning, calculating, and this time, I was ready. A sharp knock at the door cut through the quiet concentration of my midday review. I had been immersed in acquisition proposals, weighty documents spread across my desk like a cartographer's map of distant futures. When Marcus's voice pierced the stillness. "There's a Walter Jenkins here to see you. No appointment, but he says it's urgent." My pen paused mid-signature. Walter Jenkins didn't travel without cause. Age and long-earned stature had allowed him to summon clients to his office rather than venturing out himself. For him to arrive at the museum unannounced, something consequential had shifted. "Send him in," I replied, already clearing space on my desk, brushing aside folders and adjusting the light to create an illusion of calm. Walter entered with deliberate steps, each one slower than I remembered. His leather briefcase, scuffed at the edges and dulled by decades of service, swung low at his side. Today, the stoop of his shoulders and the weight in his gaze betrayed more than just years. They bore forewarning. "Alexandra," he said gravely, lowering himself into the chair opposite mine, "I've just come from a 3-hour meeting with your father and James. I thought it best you heard what transpired from me directly, rather than through their filters." A cold tension coiled in my stomach. "They're challenging the trust?" He shook his head, slow and deliberate. "They considered it. Your father even brought in one of the firm's top estate specialists to comb through every clause. But the trust is airtight. Harrison was nothing if not meticulous, and your stewardship has been beyond reproach. There's no legal footing for a challenge." Relief swept over me in a brief, fragile wave, quickly eclipsed by a new unease. If not a challenge, then what? I leaned in. "So what did they want from you?" Walter exhaled, the sigh of a man who had borne uncomfortable truths for too long. "Information, mainly. Edward, your father, was furious that I'd kept the trust hidden from him all these years. I reminded him, quite firmly, that client confidentiality bound me. Harrison was my client in this matter, not Edward Harrington." I could practically see my father's indignation, his features tightening, voice sharp with the expectation that allegiance should follow bloodlines. He had always assumed that old family ties would bend loyalty to his will. "Once he came to terms with that," Walter continued, "we moved on to what happens next. Alexandra, you should prepare yourself. They're not ready to accept the conditions you outlined last night." "I expected resistance," I replied evenly. "What are they proposing instead?" From the briefcase came a document, neatly typed, its edges crisp and intentions carefully concealed. Walter handed it to me, watching as I scanned the preamble. "They acknowledge the trust and your role as trustee," he explained, "but propose a shift in governance. They want the family council to hold equal voting power, with any disputes sent to independent arbitration. You would no longer have unilateral authority." I absorbed the words slowly. It was a clever blow, not a rejection of the trust, but a reshaping of its power, a dilution dressed in diplomacy. "That undermines everything Harrison intended," I said. "He created the trust to safeguard Oakridge from exactly this kind of compromise, preservation over popularity." "I said as much," Walter nodded. They also offered a revised financial plan. Instead of James and Catherine contributing directly to Oakridge's upkeep, they propose a family foundation. It would be funded mainly by your father, with James contributing annually as his income grows. The foundation would assume responsibility for all estate expenses. The strategy was shrewd. It removed them from personal obligation while appearing altruistic. If the foundation controlled Oakridge's finances, my years of sacrifice would become little more than historical footnotes. And the clause protecting the estate's historic character? I asked, already suspecting the answer. They're willing to uphold restrictions on external modifications, but they want more flexibility with the interior, especially the East Wing. James and Catherine intend to live there. Of course they do. I leaned back, letting the weight of it all settle into my bones. Their proposal wasn't unreasonable, not on its surface, but each concession eroded the trust's core, that Oakridge be protected from transient ambitions and treated not as a stage for personal comfort, but as a legacy to preserve. There's more, Walter added quietly, his voice gentler now. Something your father shared. I think you should hear it. I met his eyes, bracing. They're under far more financial pressure than you realize. Edward made a series of poor investment decisions some years ago. They lost most of their retirement savings. They've been living off what little remains in a rapidly shrinking pool of assets, none of which are tied to Oakridge. The air thickened, my mind raced, aligning these revelations with quiet shifts I'd noticed over the years. Mother's growing anxiety over expenses, father's relentless work schedule, even as his peers retired, the way they'd come to rely on James to maintain appearances. It all made sense now. They need him to take over Oakridge, I said aloud, the truth settling with cold clarity, because they can't afford to anymore, even with my support. Walter nodded gravely. Your contributions have prevented disaster, foreclosure, forced sale, but they've been patchwork, not enough to stabilize everything. Your parents have been covering the shortfalls with loans and credit lines that are fast approaching their limits. I closed my eyes briefly. So their urgency wasn't just favoritism cloaked in concern, it was desperation. Why didn't they tell me, I asked, though the answer hung in the silence between us like a ghost already named. Pride, Walter said softly. Your father's especially. He's never been comfortable showing vulnerability. And with you, he believes you judge him through Harrison's eyes. He wasn't wrong. I had inherited my grandfather's passion for preservation, yes, but also his criticism, his skepticism toward my father's priorities, his short-term gambles and shifting ambitions. That filter was hard to discard. What do you think I should do? I asked at last, leaning on Walter, not as my legal advisor, but as a man who had known my family's intricacies longer than I'd been alive. You hold all the authority, he said plainly. The trust grants you that. You can reject their proposal outright and enforce your original terms. No one can stop you. I waited. He wasn't finished. But if you'll allow me, I'd suggest weighing not just what secures Oakridge's future, but what might also mend the fractures in your family. Preservation doesn't have to mean isolation. You think I should compromise? I asked, not in protest, but in curiosity. I think, Walter replied carefully, you should negotiate from strength, with clarity about what matters most. But be open to an agreement that reflects the legitimate concerns on both sides. Your grandfather built Oakridge to endure, but he also valued family, Alexandra, deeply. He let that final word linger, less as a directive, more as a reminder, faithfully tended for decades. She gave a quiet nod of greeting, stepping aside to let us enter the foyer, where time itself seemed to pause beneath the heavy chandeliers and paneled ceilings. The moment we crossed the threshold, the charged air inside Oakridge pressed down like the atmosphere before a summer storm. A faint trace of lavender polish hung in the hallway, Mrs. Winter's signature scent of order amid chaos, yet even its comforting familiarity couldn't disguise the tension humming in the bones of the house. My heels echoed with determined rhythm against the marble as I led Dr. Eleanor Blackwood down the corridor toward the drawing room. Every portrait we passed, Harrington ancestors rendered in oil and gilded frames, seemed to peer down with silent judgment, as if weighing the worth of the generation now assembling beneath them. Inside, they were already seated, the composition as carefully arranged as a court tableau. My father, Edward Harrington, sat upright with his fingers steepled beneath his chin, every inch the corporate tactician. Beside him, my mother, Victoria, exuded elegance tinged with fatigue. Her pearls gleamed, but her eyes flicked with calculation. James leaned against the hearth with a studied casualness, one hand resting protectively on the back of Catherine's chair. She, ever poised, held a folder in her lap, no doubt filled with annotated talking points and contingencies. Walter Jenkins stood near the window, glancing between the gathered family and the darkening sky beyond. He offered me a brief, supportive nod as I entered, followed by a respectful greeting to Dr. Blackwood. "I trust everyone's on time," I said evenly, though I knew full well they'd arrived early to craft their alliance. I turned to Eleanor. "This is Dr. Blackwood, whose expertise in historical preservation will inform our discussion." Catherine offered a diplomatic smile. "We appreciate your presence, Mr. Blackwood. I'm sure your insights will be informative." "I trust they will," Eleanor replied coolly. She stepped forward and placed her portfolio on the coffee table with a decisive sound. "I'm not here to arbitrate family disputes. My role is to speak to the structural and historical integrity of Oakridge and what any proposed changes would mean for its preservation status." Walter raised a hand gently. "Let's begin by reaffirming the purpose of tonight's meeting. We're here to examine options for Oakridge's future, legally, historically, and personally, with an eye towards solutions that serve both the Trust's directives and the family's evolving needs." I nodded, then drew out the folder I'd prepared, filled with documents, photographs, annotated trust provisions, and a proposed framework for shared stewardship. Before we begin with opinions, I'd like to ground our conversation in facts. This estate was entrusted to me because Harrison Harrington believed I would protect its legacy, not as a museum relic, but as a living, breathing part of our family's story. I intend to honor that responsibility. James shifted. "No one's disputing your role, Alexandra, but the estate's utility must evolve. Catherine and I have reviewed several modernization proposals, which would effectively gut the East Wing," I interrupted, "removing original elements, altering structural design, and compromising preservation standards that qualify Oakridge for its protected status." "That's precisely what I'm here to assess," Dr. Blackwood interjected. She opened her portfolio and extracted a large rendering. "This is a comparative analysis of the estate's architectural components across 4 preservation surveys, including the most recent one I conducted. The East Wing houses some of the most intact pre-Edwardian craftsmanship on the property." My mother sighed, fingers tightening around her teacup. "We're not trying to erase history, but there are costs involved, but substantial ones. The estate is a financial burden." "And yet," I said, turning to face her directly, "that burden wasn't too great when you sought to pass it to James behind closed doors." My father's expression darkened, but he said nothing. The silence was more telling than any defense. This was the unspoken truth finally dragged into the open. The attempted transfer had not been out of preference alone, but desperation. "I've since learned more about the financial challenges you've both been facing," I added, softer now. "I understand the motivations, if not the methods, but this estate deserves decisions made in daylight, not shadow." Victoria looked away, the mask slipping just enough to reveal a flicker of vulnerability. It was the first honest emotion I'd seen on her face in years. Walter cleared his throat, steering us gently back. "Given these layers of concern, legal stewardship, architectural integrity, family needs, I'd like to suggest a multi-phase approach. Alexandra remains trustee, but certain non-structural modifications can be considered pending preservation approval. Financial transparency from all parties. And perhaps a rotational family use schedule." A long silence followed. Then, surprisingly, Catherine leaned forward. "If the preservation guidelines are met, and if we have equal input on communal spaces, I believe we could support that approach." James hesitated, but ultimately nodded. "It's better than stalemate." My gaze moved across the room, from my father's stiff composure to my mother's furrowed brow, to Walter's calm presence, and finally to Dr. Blackwood's steady poise. The first threads of a fragile consensus were being woven, not through manipulation or legacy claims, but through clear eyes and steady hands. Later, as the conversation wound down and the storm finally broke outside, I stood once more in Oakridge's grand hallway. Rain streaked down the tall windows, the house echoing with a hush of reconciliation and progress. Whatever came next, I would face it not as the overlooked daughter, nor as a reluctant steward, But as the rightful guardian of a legacy, yet I now understood in its full complexity, its beauty, its burdens, and its quiet, enduring strength. Calm interjection, so deliberate and composed, silenced James more effectively than any argument could have. The tension in his jaw softened, though his eyes still flicked warily in my direction. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging both the concession and the subtle power it wielded. A crack had opened in the fortress of resistance, and through it the possibility of resolution began to glimmer. Mrs. Winters, ever the quiet anchor of the estate, had retreated as unobtrusively as she had arrived, but the scent of warm shortbread lingered, familiar, comforting, like the whisper of childhood tucked into the corners of this grand old house. The library, with its mahogany shelves and newly restored ceiling glimmering faintly in the lamplight, seemed to hold its breath with us. The classical figures above, gods frozen in painted drama, had borne witness to far older storms. And yet, this felt momentous. I drew a deep breath, steadying my voice. If we're agreed on the foundation's formation and the preservation first principle guiding its disbursements, then I'd propose we begin drafting governance protocols. Weighted voting allows for shared stewardship while safeguarding the estate's legacy. Walter Jenkins, ever the composed arbitrator, stepped forward, flipping open a leather-bound folio with practiced ease. I can work with Alexandra and Dr. Blackwood to draft preliminary language. We'll circulate it for review before anything is finalized. His tone was gentle, but the underlying structure of his words promised order, a bridge across the emotional chasms laid bare tonight. Victoria Harrington stirred slightly, the pearls at her neck catching the lamplight. "Alexandra," she said, her voice now tinged with a rare vulnerability, "do you truly believe the children will know this place, will love it, as you have?" Her eyes searched mine not for facts, but for hope. I hesitated, not from doubt, but from the weight of the answer. "They'll love it if we let them see it, not as a relic, but as a living place, a sanctuary with roots deeper than the arguments we've had about it. Oakridge is more than history. It's memory and architecture. It's legacy in every beam. If we teach them to listen to its silence, they'll understand." My mother's gaze dropped for a moment, and I saw her hand brush against the worn arm of the settee, the same one she had sat in during winter evenings, embroidering as my grandfather read aloud by the hearth. The past wasn't gone. It pulsed through these walls. Dr. Blackwood interjected with her usual composed authority. "Preservation doesn't mean ossification. A structure lives when it adapts, so long as it does not forget itself. The East Wing can welcome new life without betraying what it has been." Edward Harrington exhaled slowly, hands steepled beneath his chin. "Then we must all agree to remember," he said, more to himself than anyone else, "and to invest not just money but care." He looked at me. "Alexandra, I opposed your secrecy because I feared it would drive a wedge between us. But I see now that, even in silence, you honored the trust far more faithfully than I allowed myself to believe." A rare admission. I offered no smile, just a quiet nod. Emotion stirred in me, not as triumph but as relief. We were not healed, not yet, but the bleeding had slowed. James shifted again, less guarded now. "And what of access?" he asked. "If we're to live here, raise a family, how do we balance that against guided tours, preservation work, filming requests?" "A shared calendar set 6 months in advance, with priority periods defined," I answered. "I'm willing to formalize limitations on public access during school terms and family events. But in return, we honor open days, fundraising galas, and the Heritage Society's expectations." Catherine nodded slowly. "That's manageable, and we'll invest in infrastructure, soundproofing, security, staff. If it's to be both home and heritage site, it must be prepared for both." We were building a framework. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was real. As the meeting wore on, we debated clauses, boundaries, fallback options. The fire dwindled to embers. Dr. Blackwood took occasional notes, her presence a steadying influence. Walter mediated with the finesse of someone who'd shepherded more than a few dynastic disputes through treacherous waters. At last, the hour grew late. Papers were closed, voices softer. The mood, though weary, was no longer brittle. James rose first. "I still have questions," he admitted, "but I also have fewer fears." He looked to me, grudging respect flickering behind his eyes. You held the line. And I will continue to, I replied. But that doesn't mean I won't listen. Catherine came to me then, a quiet gesture, just a hand lightly on my forearm. Thank you, she said simply. Outside the library, the corridor glowed with the golden hush of lamplight. Somewhere above, the house creaked softly, as if shifting its great bones after long stillness. I turned back once just before leaving the room and let my gaze rise to the painted ceiling. Hera, cloaked in starry blue, looked down from her restored place in the heavens, her hand raised, not in judgment, but in benediction. And in that moment I understood. This house would outlive us all, but it would carry the shape of our hands within its walls. Heated silence gave way to my voice as I leaned forward, my tone calm, but weighted with intent. There's one more matter we've yet to address, I said, redirecting the room's attention to a point conspicuously absent from the counterproposal. Recognition of my past contributions. A pause rippled through the gathering. Over the past decade, I've personally invested more than $500,000 into the preservation and maintenance of Oakridge, I continued, my gaze steady. I'm not asking for reimbursement, but I do believe that level of commitment should be formally acknowledged in whatever arrangement we establish moving forward. My father's brow furrowed, his jaw tightening, an instinctive flicker of resistance. But before he could offer the rebuttal already forming on his lips, my mother spoke with rare clarity and conviction. Of course it should be acknowledged, Victoria said firmly, her elegant composure unwavering. The truth is, without your efforts, Alexandra, we would have lost Oakridge years ago. That deserves recognition, not just in sentiment, but in the actual documents we sign. Her words landed with quiet finality, catching even Edward off guard. He blinked once, then looked away, momentarily stripped of his usual control. Across the table, James shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent, his silence speaking louder than dissent. Walter, sensing the momentum shift, leaned in slightly. Let's document these points of agreement, he suggested diplomatically, and continue working through the rest. And so, for the next 2 hours, we worked with relentless focus. The emotional edges softened into deliberate negotiations as we tackled Oakridge's future, its governance, finances, and the nuances of preservation. Eleanor Blackwood's measured insights proved invaluable. She outlined precisely which architectural elements demanded absolute fidelity and where subtle modernization could honor history without distorting it. By 9 o'clock, we had forged something that, while imperfect, held the shape of genuine compromise. The trust would remain intact with me as trustee. A newly formed family council would advise on major decisions, offering a semblance of balance. The east wing of Oakridge would become James and Catherine's primary residence, with flexibility for interior renovation, while the historic public rooms would retain their original grandeur. The Harrington Family Foundation was to be born from this accord, assuming responsibility for the estate's future. Every adult family member would hold a seat on its board, their voting rights clearly defined. As Walter jotted down preliminary notes, Catherine crossed the room and approached me, her expression subdued. I wanted to thank you, she said quietly, eyes not quite meeting mine, for not exercising your full legal authority. James wouldn't admit it, but we couldn't maintain Oakridge without this new structure. The foundation gives us a sustainable way forward. Her candor was like a breath of air through a long, closed room, unexpected, refreshing. After years of sidelong glances and veiled intentions, her sincerity felt oddly disarming. That's what I want too, I replied, my voice low but resolute. Oakridge deserves better than to become the stage for a family war. She nodded slowly, reflective. Power struggles, she murmured. I misjudged you, Alexandra. I thought your resistance came from resentment. I see now it came from something else, something real. That small moment, a flicker of understanding across old divides, felt more significant than any legal clause we'd debated. It hinted at the possibility of something authentic, a relationship not defined by rivalry, but by mutual respect. As the meeting wound down and others began gathering their belongings, my father approached. The lines around his eyes were drawn tight, his usual composure still intact, but the ire of our earlier confrontation had cooled. Your grandfather would have approved, he said, stiffly but sincerely, not just of how Oakridge is being preserved, but of how you've managed this revelation. You could have used the trust as a weapon, but you didn't. Coming from Edward Harrington, that was a rare admission. I held his gaze. I never wanted to hurt anyone, I said. I only wanted Oakridge protected, and for my role in that to be seen. He nodded once, sharply. We'll have a lot to sort out in the weeks ahead, but I want you to know, despite my initial reaction, I recognize what you've done for this family's legacy. It wasn't an apology. Not for the years of dismissing my efforts, nor for nearly transferring property that was never his to give. But it was something, a first step, an opening. Later, as Dr. Blackwood and I prepared to leave, I paused in the foyer. Oakridge enveloped us in silence, its time-worn walls dense with memory. It had stood sentinel through generations of Harrington triumphs and betrayals, its bones steeped in secrets, grief, and ceremony. Tonight, those same walls had borne witness to something different, tentative but profound. The birth of an arrangement not built on illusion or blood rights, but on merit and honesty. The air outside had cooled. The storm clouds that had loomed earlier were gone. Above the estate, stars re-emerged one by one. The symbolism was almost too neat, but undeniable. We had not reached a resolution, not entirely, but the turbulence had passed, revealing the possibility of clarity. The weeks that followed surged with intensity. There were documents to draft, legal language to refine, financial structures to solidify. And beneath all of that, the deeper, quieter work of repairing trust and redefining relationships. Each day brought calls with Walter, weekly discussions with family, and frequent consultations with our financial advisors. Meanwhile, I kept up with my responsibilities at the museum, managing exhibitions while dedicating evenings and weekends to laying the foundation, literally and figuratively, for Oakridge's future. Oddly, the dual focus sharpened both roles. My expertise in preservation informed our decisions about the estate's architectural evolution, while the emotional diplomacy of family negotiations honed a kind of leadership I hadn't known I needed. It bled into my work, deepening it. 3 weeks after that pivotal meeting, we reconvened at Walter's office for the formal signing. The venue was neutral. Neither the charged grandeur of Oakridge nor the commanding authority of my father's firm. Walter's polished conference room offered just the right tone, solemn, focused, fair. As we gathered around the gleaming mahogany table, I noticed subtle changes. My father, ever the consummate attorney, still wore his professional mask. But beneath it, there was a shift, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared purpose, if not yet affection. The future of Oakridge would not be simple, but tonight at last it belonged to all of us. A flicker of warmth and even the granite formality that had long defined our family's gatherings. My mother, usually poised, remote, watched me now with a gaze tinged by something startling. Respect. Wistful, yes, but clear-eyed and resolute. Across from her, James's typical smirk of superiority had dissolved into something quieter. Grudging acknowledgement, perhaps even acceptance. And Catherine, a Fleischer, elegant and sharply observant, had transformed from wary onlooker to unexpectedly capable ally, her voice calm yet firm during the grueling process of shaping what Oakridge would become. Walter Jenkins stood at the head of the long table, his manner formal, the gravity of the occasion pressed into every syllable. Today marks a turning point for the Harrington family, he declared, his voice echoing gently through the vaulted room like a benediction. In his hands rested a collection of documents, leather-bound, gold-embossed, with the Harrington crest, a touch Catherine had insisted upon. Not for vanity, but for symbolism. Proof that despite decades of disagreements and divergent dreams, we still shared a lineage, a legacy, a name etched into the stone of Oakridge itself. These documents, Walter continued, establish a new governance framework for Oakridge, honoring both the explicit directives and the enduring spirit of Harrison Harrington's trust. He handed the folios to each of us, the leather cool and weighty beneath my fingers. As he outlined the provisions, I felt the air in the room still, not tense but reverent, as though we all knew something meaningful was being woven from the frayed edges of our past. The Harrison Harrington Trust, Walter said, remains the legal owner of Oakridge. Alexandra continues as trustee. His eyes flicked briefly toward me. I gave a slight nod, though the weight of that title pressed heavier than ever before. The newly formed Harrington Family Foundation, he continued, will assume financial responsibility for the estate's upkeep, taxes, and preservation. All adult members of the family will serve as board members. I glanced at my father. Edward Harrington's expression, typically composed to the point of unreadability, now betrayed a quiet sense of approval. He gave a single, deliberate nod. The foundation had been his idea, his way of staying connected to Oakridge's finances while crafting tax strategies with the precision of a surgeon, a compromise, yes, but also a contribution. James and Catherine, Walter said, turning to them, will retain lifetime occupancy of the East Wing. They'll have considerable autonomy over its interior renovation, as detailed in Appendix B. These updates have been reviewed and approved in consultation with Dr. Eleanor Blackwood. The East Wing, their future. James and Catherine exchanged a glance, one of private celebration. For them, this arrangement meant freedom, a canvas on which to build a contemporary home for the family they hoped to raise, without eroding the estate's historical essence. And thanks to Dr. Blackwood's oversight, the original character of Oakridge's public rooms would remain preserved. Any future modifications would require the blessing of both the family council and preservation experts. Walter turned to a final document, one separated from the others by a crimson ribbon. His voice softened, but held firm. This final acknowledgement recognizes Alexandra's financial support of Oakridge over the past decade, a total of $573,000 spent on preservation, maintenance, and restoration. While this document carries no provision for reimbursement, it establishes the historical record and affirms the significance of these contributions to the estate's survival. Silence followed, not of resistance but of reckoning, of truths long kept in shadow, now exposed to the light. That single document had been the fiercest battleground of our negotiations. My father had balked at first. To him, it smacked of indictment, a passive rebuke of his own stewardship. But for me, this wasn't about casting blame. It was about rooting our future in truth. I hadn't poured myself into Oakridge for recognition. I had done it for the legacy. But legacies fade when untethered from fact. This was the ledger of love made visible. Before we proceed to signatures, Walter said, does anyone wish to propose amendments or voice concerns? No one spoke. But the silence wasn't sharp-edged or brimming with unresolved tension. It was quiet in the way snowfall is quiet, full, reflective, inevitable. Then my father stirred, drawing in a breath with the gravitas he usually reserved for high-stakes litigation. These documents represent a fair resolution, he said carefully. They honor Harrison's intentions while addressing our family's evolving needs. He turned to me, his gaze unwavering. Alexandra, your grandfather would be proud of you. You've led with both integrity and flexibility, two traits he prized above all. My heart caught. For a man who had spent his life in the long shadow of Harrison Harrington, those words carried the weight of a confession, a release and a blessing all at once. Thank you, I replied quietly. Not out of formality, but from a place deep enough that no further words could follow. These arrangements, I added, safeguard what matters most about Oakridge, while leaving room for the next generation to make it their own. That balance, that was always grandfather's vision. Walter moved us through the signing. One by one, we leaned forward to inscribe our names, each stroke of ink sealing not just legal obligation, but emotional investment. It was more than governance. It was a shared vow. When my pen lifted from the final document, I felt something shift, not just in me, but in all of us. A stillness, a sense that, for the first time in far too long, we had found a common truth to stand upon. Afterwards, we dined at Westfield's, a quiet break from the tradition, suggested by my father himself. Usually he would vanish back to work, shrugging off sentiment like an ill-fitting coat. But not today. Today he stayed. As we gathered around the table, my mother lifted her water glass. To Oakridge, she said, her voice light but sincere, and to the Harrington family, moving forward together. We raised our glasses, not out of duty, but in shared conviction. Something in the room had softened. The air between us, once brittle with unspoken grievances, now felt breathable. The conversation flowed with unfamiliar ease. James spoke candidly about balancing historical fidelity with creating a welcoming space for the children they hoped to have. My mother expressed relief, genuine, unguarded, that Oakridge's financial stability was now secure. Even my father, long skeptical of Harrison's secretive ways, admitted the trust's wisdom, though he couldn't help noting the complications its secrecy had created. It wasn't harmony, not yet, but it was honest. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough.